The cabin stood silent in the darkness, its windows black against the cold Montana night. Inside, a woman held a letter in trembling hands. The paper had yellowed with age, but the words remained sharp, cutting through decades of silence, like a blade through fog. Lorraine Beckett stood alone in that small room, her silver hair catching the faint moonlight that slipped through the dusty glass. Tears rolled down her weathered cheeks as she read the final line once more. "Emmett," she whispered into the emptiness. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Her voice broke on his name. 25 years since she had last heard his laugh. 25 years since she had felt his calloused hand brush against her cheek. And now, standing in a cabin she never knew existed, Lorraine finally understood why a stranger had left her everything he owned. But to understand how she arrived at this moment, we must go back 3 weeks. Back to a morning when Lorraine Beckett was still invisible, still forgotten, still waiting for a miracle she had stopped believing in. 3 weeks earlier, the first frost of autumn settled over the small town of Millbrook, Montana. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. Along Main Street, shop owners swept their sidewalks and exchanged quiet greetings. Cars moved slowly past the old courthouse, the hardware store, the diner where farmers gathered for coffee before dawn. No one noticed the woman walking along the edge of the road. Lorraine Beckett moved through the morning shadows like a ghost. Her thin coat, patched at the elbows with mismatched fabric, did little against the cold. Her shoes, worn through at the soles, made soft sounds against the pavement. In her hands, she carried a plastic bag half filled with aluminum cans. She was 62 years old. Her hair had turned silver years ago, though she could still remember when it had been the color of autumn leaves. Her face bore the lines of a life that had demanded more than it had given. But her eyes remained clear, sharp, watching the world with a quiet dignity that most people never bothered to notice. Because most people did not notice Lorraine Beckett at all. She had lived in Millbrook for over 30 years, but she might as well have been a stranger. Shop owners looked past her when she entered their stores. Neighbors she had once known crossed the street when they saw her coming. Children pointed and whispered. Adults pretended she did not exist. Lorraine understood. She had become the thing that comfortable people feared most. A reminder that safety was an illusion. A warning that anyone could fall. And she had fallen far. The church shelter where she slept sat at the end of Miller Road, a modest building with white paint peeling from its wooden siding. Pastor Daniels kept the doors open year-round, offering cots and meals to anyone who needed them. In winter, the shelter filled with faces worn by cold and hunger. In summer, it emptied as wanderers moved on to other towns. But Lorraine stayed. She had nowhere else to go. That morning, she finished her route early. The recycling center would not open for another hour, so she sat on a bench outside the shelter and watched the sun rise over the distant mountains. The light painted the peaks in shades of gold and amber. For a moment, the world looked beautiful. Then the moment passed, and Lorraine returned to the quiet work of surviving another day. She did not know that everything was about to change. The car appeared on Miller Road just before 9 in the morning. It was a sedan, dark blue, polished in a way that seemed out of place on the dusty roads of Millbrook. Lorraine watched it approach with the wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. The car stopped in front of the shelter. A man stepped out. He was perhaps 50 years old, dressed in a gray suit that fit him precisely. His hair had grayed at the temples, and he carried a leather folder under one arm. His face was kind, but serious, the face of someone who spent his days delivering news that changed lives. He looked around the shelter grounds, then his eyes found Lorraine sitting on the bench. "Mrs. Beckett," he asked, walking toward her. Lorraine tensed. No one had called her Mrs. Beckett in years. At the shelter, she was simply Lori. To the townspeople who noticed her at all, she was the homeless woman, or the can lady, or nothing at all. "Who's asking?" The man stopped a respectful distance away. "My name is Harrison Whitmore. I'm an attorney." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I've been trying to locate you for several weeks." Lorraine studied him. Attorneys did not visit homeless shelters to deliver good news. They came with eviction notices, with warrants, with papers that stripped away whatever small dignity remained. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said quietly. Whitmore shook his head. "No, Mrs. Beckett, you haven't." He gestured toward the bench. "May I sit?" She nodded, though she kept her plastic bag of cans close against her side. Whitmore settled onto the bench beside her. For a moment, he simply looked out at the mountains as if gathering his thoughts. Mrs. Beckett, do you remember a man named Wallace Pemberton? The name struck her like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of memory spread outward, touching places she had long ago sealed away. Pemberton, she repeated slowly. I don't think I know that name. He lived alone in a cabin about 12 miles north of town, at the edge of the national forest. Lorraine shook her head. I'm sorry, I've never met anyone by that name. Whitmore nodded as if he had expected this answer. Mr. Pemberton passed away 3 weeks ago. He was 87 years old. The attorney opened his leather folder and removed a document. Before he died, he updated his will. He left specific instructions that his entire estate should pass to you. Lorraine stared at him. That's impossible. I assure you it's quite real. Whitmore handed her the document. This is a copy of the will. Your name appears on page 2. Her hands trembled as she took the paper. The legal language blurred before her eyes, but there it was printed in black ink, Lorraine Marie Beckett. I don't understand, she said. I've never met this man. Why would he leave me anything? Whitmore's expression softened. According to Mr. Pemberton's notes, he believed he owed a debt to your family, specifically to your husband. The word hit her like a physical blow. My husband, she whispered. Emmett Beckett. 25 years since she had spoken that name aloud. 25 years since the phone call that had shattered her world. 25 years since she had stood at a hospital bedside holding a hand that would never squeeze back. What does my husband have to do with this? Whitmore paused before answering. In 1999, there was a construction accident at a site just outside of town. A scaffolding collapse. Several workers were injured. He met her eyes. Wallace Pemberton was trapped beneath the fallen structure. According to the records, your husband pulled him free. He saved Mr. Pemberton's life. Lorraine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She remembered that night. She remembered Emmett coming home late, covered in concrete dust and dried blood. She remembered the way his hands had shaken as he washed them at the kitchen sink. She remembered asking what had happened, and she remembered his answer. Just a bad day at work, but everyone made it out. He had never mentioned saving anyone's life. He had never spoken of a man named Wallace Pemberton. He had simply washed his hands, eaten his dinner, and held her close as they fell asleep. That was who Emmett Beckett had been, a man who saved lives and never thought to mention it. Mrs. Beckett, Whitmore's voice pulled her back to the present. She realized tears were rolling down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. It's been a long time since anyone mentioned my husband. I understand. Whitmore withdrew another document from his folder. Mr. Pemberton's estate is modest, but it includes the cabin where he lived, approximately 15 acres of surrounding land, and a small amount of savings. The total value is difficult to estimate, but the property alone could be worth several $100,000. Lorraine shook her head slowly. Several $100,000. Yes. She looked down at her plastic bag of aluminum cans. This morning she had calculated that she might earn $12 if she collected enough. Enough for a few meals. Enough to survive another week. And now a stranger had left her more than she could comprehend. Why, she asked, why would he wait until now if he wanted to repay my husband? Why didn't he come forward years ago? Whitmore hesitated. I can't say for certain, but Mr. Pemberton was a private man. He lived alone for many decades. Perhaps he was waiting for the right moment. Perhaps he only recently learned of your circumstances. The attorney reached into his folder one more time. He also left you this. It was an envelope yellowed with age. Her name was written across the front in careful, deliberate handwriting. Lorraine turned it over in her hands. The envelope was sealed, the paper smooth beneath her fingers. Mr. Pemberton requested that you open this after you visit the cabin, Whitmore said. I don't know what it contains. For a long moment, Lorraine simply held the envelope. The weight of it seemed far greater than mere paper should allow. When can I see it? She asked quietly. The cabin. Whitmore smiled gently. Whenever you're ready, I can drive you there today if you'd like. Lorraine looked out at the mountains one more time. The sun had risen higher now, burning away the morning mist. The world looked different than it had an hour ago. Brighter, more uncertain. Yes, she said. I'd like that very much. The drive north took them through landscapes that grew wilder with every mile. Whitmore's sedan navigated roads that turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to packed dirt. The trees grew thicker on either side, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the autumn light into patterns of gold and shadow. Lorraine watched the forest pass by her window. She had not left Millbrook in years. The shelter, the recycling center, the few blocks of Main Street had become her entire world. Beyond those boundaries, she had stopped believing that anything existed for her. But the forest existed. The mountains existed. And somewhere ahead, a cabin waited with secrets she had never imagined. After nearly an hour, Whitmore turned the sedan onto a narrow road, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Pine branches scraped against the windows as they descended into a small valley. The air grew colder sharp with the scent of evergreens and damp earth. Then the trees parted and Lorraine saw it. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, its weathered boards gray with age. The roof sagged slightly in one corner. The porch leaned just enough to suggest decades of snow and rain. Windows filmed with dust reflected the forest like dark mirrors. It looked like a place that time had forgotten. Whitmore stopped the car near a rusted gate. "This is it." Lorraine stepped out slowly. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on the small structure before her. For 25 years, a stranger had lived here alone. A man who owed his life to her husband. A man who had watched and waited, and finally decided to leave everything to a woman he had never met. "Mr. Pemberton rarely came to town," Whitmore said, joining her at the gate. The few people who remembered him described him as quiet, private, the kind of man who kept to himself. Lorraine nodded slowly, like someone hiding from the world. Perhaps. They walked together toward the cabin. The gravel crunched beneath Lorraine's worn shoes. Each step felt heavy with significance, as if she were approaching something far larger than a simple wooden structure. The porch creaked as she climbed the 2 steps to the door. Whitmore remained at the bottom, giving her space. "The key," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Mr. Pemberton left instructions that you should be the first to enter." He handed her a small iron key, rusted at the edges but still solid. Lorraine turned it over in her palm. Such a simple object, such an ordinary thing, and yet it would open a door that had been closed for decades. She slid the key into the lock. The mechanism resisted, at first stiff from years of disuse. Then with a soft click, its doors swung inward. The smell hit her first. Cedar and dust in the faint sweetness of wood smoke long since faded. The interior was dim, lit only by the pale light filtering through the dirty windows. Shapes emerged from the shadows as her eyes adjusted. A small wooden table, a single chair worn smooth by use, a cold iron stove in the corner, shelves lined with books whose spines had faded to illegibility. Nothing valuable, nothing remarkable, just the remnants of a life lived in solitude. Lorraine stepped inside. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, announcing her presence to the empty room. She moved slowly, touching the back of the chair, running her fingers along the edge of the table. Everything felt old but cared for, maintained by hands that had taken their time. "He lived simply," she said softly. Whitmore remained in the doorway. "He did." Lorraine walked to the window and looked out at the forest. The trees stretched endlessly toward the mountains, their branches swaying gently in the wind. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. A man had lived here alone for decades, watching these same trees, breathing this same air. A man who had survived because her husband had chosen to run toward danger instead of away from it. She thought of Emmett's hands, calloused and strong. She thought of his laugh, the way it rumbled deep in his chest. She thought of all the mornings he had left for work, whistling softly, never knowing that any day might be his last. He had saved Wallace Pemberton's life. And then 4 months later, he had gone to work on a different site and never come home. The scaffolding had collapsed without warning. Emmett had been standing on the 3rd level when the supports gave way. They told her he died instantly. They told her he didn't suffer. They told her all the things people say when there is nothing left to say. And now, 25 years later, she stood in a dead man's cabin, holding a letter she had not yet opened, wondering how the threads of her life had tangled themselves into this impossible knot. "Mrs. Beckett," she turned. Whitmore stood watching her with an expression of gentle concern. "The letter," he reminded her. "Mr. Pemberton wanted you to read it here." Lorraine reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the envelope. Her name stared back at her in that careful handwriting. She slid her finger beneath the seal. The paper tore softly, releasing a faint scent of something sweet. Inside was a single page folded twice. Lorraine unfolded it slowly and began to read. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, careful and deliberate, the writing of someone who had taken time to choose each word. Mrs. Beckett, it began, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are standing in the place that has been my home for more than 30 years. I imagine you are confused. I imagine you have questions that this letter cannot fully answer. But I will try to explain what I can. 25 years ago, your husband saved my life. I was working beneath the scaffolding when the supports collapsed. Steel beams fell around me like rain. I was pinned beneath a crossbar, unable to move, certain that I was about to die. And then your husband appeared. He did not hesitate. He did not calculate the risk. He simply lifted the beam and pulled me free. When I tried to thank him, he laughed and said that anyone would have done the same. But that is not true, Mrs. Beckett. Most people would have run the other way. Most people would have waited for help. Your husband ran toward the danger, not away from it. That is a rare thing, a precious thing, and I have never forgotten it. I spent many years trying to find a way to repay the debt. I thought of approaching your family directly, but I learned that your husband had passed away only months after he saved me. The news devastated me. I felt responsible, though I know that is not rational. Grief rarely is. I retreated to this cabin and tried to forget, but forgetting proved impossible. Over the years, I began to notice you in town. I saw you walking along the roads collecting cans. I saw you helping at the church. I saw the way people looked past you as if you were not there. And I saw something else too, something that reminded me of your husband. You carried yourself with quiet dignity. You helped others even when you had nothing. You refused to let circumstance steal your humanity. Your husband saved my life once, but watching you taught me what life is truly worth. I cannot repay the debt I owe to Emmett Beckett. The dead are beyond our reach, but I can leave what little I have to the woman who carries his spirit forward. This cabin is yours now. The land around it is yours. And there is something else, something that I have kept hidden for many years, something that I believe you will understand. Look beneath what people usually ignore. You will know what to do. With deepest gratitude, Wallace Pemberton. Lorraine lowered the letter. Her hands were trembling. Mrs. Beckett. Whitmore's voice seemed to come from very far away. He watched me, she said quietly. All those years, he was watching. The attorney nodded slowly. It seemed so. Lorraine looked around the cabin with new eyes. This place was not just a hermit's retreat. It was a monument to a debt that could never be repaid. And somewhere within these walls, Wallace Pemberton had hidden something he wanted her to find. Look beneath what people usually ignore. Her gaze dropped to the floor. The wooden boards were worn from decades of footsteps darkened by time and use. Most of them lay flat and even fitted together with the precision of someone who understood craftsmanship. But near the stone fireplace, something looked different. Lorraine walked slowly toward the hearth. The stones were blackened with old soot. The mortar had cracked in places. An iron poker leaned against the wall, its handle worn smooth. She knelt beside the fireplace and ran her hand across the floorboards. Most felt solid, firmly secured, but one board directly in front of the hearth shifted slightly beneath her palm. Mr. Whitmore, she said, come look at this. The attorney crossed the room and knelt beside her. Together they examined the board. The edges were not perfectly aligned with the others. A narrow gap ran along one side, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Lorraine pressed her palm against the wood. It dipped slightly, then rose again. There's something underneath, she said. Whitmore reached for the iron poker and handed it to her. Try lifting the edge. Lorraine slid the metal tip into the gap between the boards. The wood resisted at first, years of disuse having sealed it in place. Then with a soft creak, the board tilted upward. Dust rose into the air, catching the pale light from the windows. Lorraine waved it away and peered into the darkness beneath the floor. At first she saw nothing but shadow. Then her eyes adjusted and she caught the faint gleam of something metallic. Hand me your flashlight, she said. Whitmore pulled a small light from his coat pocket and passed it to her. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow space between the cabin floor and the ground below. And there, nestled between the wooden beams, sat a metal box. It was rectangular, perhaps 18 inches long and 12 inches wide. Dust covered its surface, but the metal beneath looked solid, well preserved. Someone had placed it here deliberately, carefully, as if preparing for the day when it would finally be discovered. My God, Whitmore breathed. Lorraine reached down and gripped the edges of the box. It was heavier than she expected, substantial, the weight of secrets long kept. Together with Whitmore, she lifted it from its hiding place and set it gently on the wooden table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The box had a simple clasp, no lock, no combination. Just a metal latch that had protected its contents for decades. Lorraine looked at Whitmore. He nodded slowly. She reached forward and lifted the clasp. The sound of metal clicking echoed through the cabin. The lid rose smoothly, revealing what lay within. Paper. Stacks of them, neatly organized, tied together with faded string. Old envelopes, folded maps, legal documents bearing official seals. And beneath it all, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Lorraine's breath caught. "What is all this?" Whitmore leaned closer, his eyes scanning the documents. He carefully lifted one of the bundles and untied the string. His face changed as he read the first page. "Mrs. Beckett," he said slowly, "I think you need to see this." He handed her a large folded paper. Lorraine spread it across the table, smoothing the creases with her palms. It was a map, hand-drawn but precise, showing the cabin and the surrounding landscape. But the boundaries extended far beyond the small clearing where they stood. "This is a property survey," Whitmore said. He traced his finger along the lines. "The cabin sits here at the southern edge. But look at this." His finger moved northward, following the boundary markers across hills and streams, through dense forest toward the distant mountains. Lorraine felt her heart beginning to pound. "How much land is this?" Whitmore studied the numbers written along the edges. His face grew pale. "According to this survey," he said quietly, "Wallace Pemberton owned approximately 312 acres of forest land." The number hung in the air like something impossible. 312 acres, Lorraine repeated. "Yes." She stared at the map. The shaded area marked timberland stretched across the page, vast and green and completely unexpected. "That's not possible," she said. "If someone in this town rented that much land, people would know about it." Whitmore shook his head slowly. "Not if he never told anyone." Lorraine looked back at the box. The other documents waited in neat stacks, each one potentially revealing more secrets. "What else is in there?" Whitmore carefully removed another bundle of papers. Land purchase agreements dated across 30 years. Each one showed Wallace Pemberton buying small parcels of forest from different sellers. A farmer selling unused land. A logging company abandoning an unprofitable parcel. A widow disposing of property she could not maintain. Piece by piece, purchase by purchase. Wallace Pemberton had assembled an empire in secret. "He bought it over decades," Lorraine said. "Yes. But why? Why would anyone do that?" Whitmore reached into the box and withdrew the leather-bound journal. "Perhaps this will tell us." He handed it to Lorraine. The leather felt warm beneath her fingers, as if it still held the heat of the man who had written in it. She opened the cover carefully. The first page bore a date from more than 30 years ago. The handwriting was familiar now, the same careful script as the letter she had read earlier. "June 14th, 1994, she read aloud. "Today I bought another small piece of land along the northern ridge. The logging company didn't care about it anymore. But the forest deserves better than abandonment." She turned the page. September 2nd, 1999. Developers approached the town council again, a company called Hargrove Development. They want to build luxury cabins along the river. If they succeed, the forest will not survive. Lorraine looked up at Whitmore. Hargrove Development. The attorney's expression had grown serious. "I know that name, Preston Hargrove. He owns one of the largest development companies in the state." Lorraine returned to the journal. The entries continued across years, documenting Wallace's quiet war against forces that wanted to transform the wilderness into profit. March 18th, 2003. Bought the final parcel today. 300 acres in total. It took half a lifetime. She turned to the next page. Now the forest is safe. The words seemed to fill the room. Lorraine closed the journal slowly and set it on the table. Wallace Pemberton had not been a hermit hiding from the world. He had been a guardian standing watch over land that others wanted to exploit. For 30 years he had fought his battle in silence, buying piece by piece, building a barrier against development. And now that battle belonged to her. "Mrs. Beckett," Whitmore said quietly, "I don't think you understand what you've inherited." "I'm beginning to. This land," he gestured toward the map, "is worth far more than a few $100,000. We're talking about millions, perhaps tens of millions." Lorraine looked at the journal, at the map, at the stacks of documents that represented a lifetime of careful planning. He didn't protect this land so someone could sell it, she said. No, Whitmore agreed, he didn't. Before either of them could speak again, a sound reached them from outside, the rumble of an engine approaching along the dirt road. Whitmore walked to the window, his face changed. Were you expecting anyone else? Lorraine asked. No. Through the dusty glass, she saw a dark sedan emerge from the trees. Unlike Whitmore's modest vehicle, this one gleamed with obvious expense. Chrome trim caught the autumn light. The windows were tinted black. The car stopped at the edge of the clearing. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was perhaps 55 years old, tall and lean, dressed in a coat that probably cost more than Lorraine had earned in the past decade. His hair was silver at the temples, swept back from a face that projected confidence and control. He removed a pair of sunglasses and surveyed the cabin with an expression of casual ownership. Then his eyes found the window where Lorraine and Whitmore stood watching. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. The man walked toward the cabin with the unhurried pace of someone who expected the world to wait for him. His polished shoes seemed impervious to the dirt and gravel. His coat remained perfectly arranged despite the wind. Whitmore opened the cabin door before the man could knock. Can I help you? The man's smile widened slightly. Good afternoon, my name is Preston Hargrove. He extended his hand. Hargrove Development. Whitmore did not take it immediately. Mr. Hargrove, this is private property. Of course it is. Preston withdrew his hand without apparent offense. I'm simply here to pay my respects. I heard about Wallace Pemberton's passing. A tragedy. You knew Mr. Pemberton. We had dealings over the years. Preston's gaze moved past Whitmore to where Lorraine stood near the table. And you must be Mrs. Beckett. Lorraine felt a chill move through her. How do you know my name? Small town, Preston said smoothly. News travels quickly. He took a step closer to the doorway. I understand you've inherited quite a bit of land. Whitmore moved to block his path. Mrs. Beckett has only just arrived. She hasn't had time to review the estate details. Of course. Preston's eyes remained fixed on Lorraine, but I imagine she's discovered the map by now, and perhaps the documents that go with it. Something cold settled in Lorraine's stomach. How do you know about the documents? Preston's smile never wavered. Wallace Pemberton and I had a complicated relationship. He owned land that I wanted to develop. He refused to sell. Year after year, he refused. He paused. I always wondered what he kept hidden in this cabin. I suppose now we know. Lorraine stepped forward. Mr. Hargrove, I don't know what your relationship with Wallace Pemberton was, and frankly, I don't care. But whatever business you had with him ended when he died. Preston nodded slowly as if considering her words. That's one way to look at it. He reached into his coat and withdrew a business card. Or you could view this as an opportunity. He placed the card on the porch railing. $5 million, Mrs. Beckett. That's my opening offer for the forest land. He let the number settle in the air. I imagine that's more money than you've seen in your entire life. Lorraine looked at the card. Her name was not on it. The card bore only a phone number and the Hargrove Development logo. I'll need time to think, she said. Preston smiled again. Of course, take all the time you need. He turned to leave, then paused at the edge of the porch. But Mrs. Beckett, I should mention something. This land has been a target for development for many years. Wallace Pemberton managed to hold off progress through stubbornness alone. Now that he's gone, others will come with offers. Some will be generous, some will be less so. Is that a threat? A observation. Preston replaced his sunglasses. This forest won't stay quiet for long. Too much money at stake. Too many interested parties. He began walking toward his car. When you're ready to discuss the future of this land, call me. I suspect we can come to an arrangement that benefits everyone. He climbed into the sedan. The engine purred to life. Moments later, the car disappeared back down the dirt road swallowed by the trees. Lorraine stood on the porch watching the space where it had been. Mrs. Beckett, Whitmore said quietly, I think we should continue reviewing those documents. She nodded slowly. Yes, I think we should. They returned to the cabin and closed the door behind them. The afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the room. Lorraine lit the old oil lamp she found on the shelf, and its warm glow pushed back the darkness. She sat at the wooden table and opened Wallace Pemberton's journal once more. This time she read more carefully, noting dates and names and the patterns that connected them. The story emerged slowly, entry by entry. A quiet man fighting a quiet war. Developers approaching the town council year after year. Proposals for resorts, luxury cabins, golf courses. Each time Wallace had responded by buying more land, creating buffer zones, blocking access routes. And throughout the journal, one name appeared again and again. Hargrove. October 9, 2005. Hargrove Development presented another proposal tonight. Luxury resort near the river. The town council seemed interested. I bought the riverside parcel the next day. They can't build what they can't access. March 15, 2010. Preston Hargrove came to the cabin today. Offered $2 million for the northern section. I refused. He was not pleased. July 22, 2015. Someone vandalized the property markers on the eastern boundary. I cannot prove it was Hargrove's people, but I have my suspicions. Lorraine closed his journal. The pieces were falling into place now. Wallace Pemberton had not simply protected the forest from development. He had specifically protected it from Preston Hargrove. For decades, the two men had waged a silent battle over these 312 acres, and now that battle was hers. Mrs. Beckett, Whitmore said, "It's getting late. Perhaps we should return to town and continue this tomorrow." Lorraine shook her head. "No, I want to stay here tonight." The attorney looked uncertain. "Are you sure the cabin has no electricity, no running water?" "I've lived without those things before." She looked around the small room. "This place belonged to a man who saved my husband's memory. I want to understand it before I make any decisions." Whitmore nodded slowly. "Very well, I'll return in the morning with supplies." He gathered his leather folder. "And Mrs. Beckett, please be careful. Preston Hargrove is not a man who accepts no easily." "I understand." After Whitmore left, Lorraine stood alone in the cabin. The silence felt different now, heavier with meaning. She walked to the window and looked out at the forest. The trees stood tall and dark against the fading sky. Their branches swayed gently in the wind, moving together like a single living thing. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly. This land had been waiting for her. She understood that now. Wallace Pemberton had spent 30 years protecting it, and then he had chosen her to carry forward his work. But why? Because her husband had once saved his life. Or was there something more? She returned to the table and opened the journal again. This time she turned to the final entries, the pages written in the weeks before Wallace died. September 3rd, the cancer has spread. The doctors say I have weeks, perhaps less. I have made my decision about the land. September 10th, Whitmore visited today. He seemed surprised by my choice of air. I told him only what he needed to know. Some things are better left unexplained. September 15th, I watched her from the car this morning. She was helping an older woman carry bags to the shelter. She didn't see me. She never does. But I see her. I have seen her for years. Lorraine's hands trembled. Her husband saved my life. But she saved something else. She reminded me why life is worth saving. The final entry was dated the day before Wallace died. Tomorrow Harrison will file the papers. The land will pass to Lorraine Beckett. She will find this journal. She will read these words, and she will understand. I have been a guardian. Now she must become one. The forest is waiting. Lorraine closed the journal. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. All those years of invisibility, all those years of being overlooked and forgotten. And somewhere in the shadows, a dying man had been watching. He had seen what others refused to see. He had recognized something worthy in a woman the world had discarded. She looked out the window at the dark forest. I understand, she whispered. I understand now. Over the next 3 days, news of Lorraine Beckett's inheritance spread through Millbrook like wildfire. At the diner on Main Street, voices rose and fell with speculation. You hear about the homeless woman, the one who collects cans. What about her? She inherited land from old Wallace Pemberton, hundreds of acres. 300 acres, I heard. That can't be right. Nobody in this town owns that much land. But the rumors were true, and soon everyone knew it. At the hardware store, men gathered around the register to share theories. At the church, Pastor Daniels fielded questions from parishioners who suddenly remembered Lorraine Beckett after years of looking past her. At the shelter, the other residents regarded her with new expressions, mixtures of envy and wonder and disbelief. Lorraine stayed at the cabin through it all. She spent her days reading Wallace's journal, studying the property maps, learning the boundaries of her new domain. She walked the land in the mornings following trails that Wallace had marked, discovering streams and clearings and stands of ancient pines that seemed to hold the silence of centuries. The forest was beautiful. She understood now why Wallace had fought so hard to protect it. But the phone calls had already begun. Whitmore reported them each afternoon when he visited with supplies. Real estate companies, investment firms, development corporations, each one wanted the same thing: the land. On the fourth day, Preston Hargrove's offer arrived by courier. It was formal this time, typed on Hargrove Development letterhead. $5 million for the forest land, with an additional $200,000 for the cabin in its immediate surroundings. Lorraine read it at the wooden table, the same table where Wallace had written his journal entries for 30 years. Then she picked up the phone and dialed the number on Preston's business card. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Beckett, I was hoping you would call." "I've received your offer," she said, and she looked out the window at the trees. The morning light filtered through their branches, creating patterns of gold and shadow. "No," she said. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry," Preston's voice had lost some of its smoothness. "The answer is no, I'm not selling." Another pause. When Preston spoke again, his tone had changed. The charm remained, but something colder lurked beneath it. "Mrs. Beckett, perhaps you don't understand the situation. $5 million is an extremely generous offer. Most people would accept without hesitation. I'm not most people. No." There was a faint edge in his voice now. "I suppose you're not." He paused. "May I ask why you're refusing?" Lorraine looked at Wallace's journal sitting open on the table before her. "Because a man spent 30 years protecting this forest," she said, "and I'm not going to be the person who destroys it." Silence filled the line. When Preston finally spoke, his words carried a weight that felt like a warning. "Mrs. Beckett, I've been trying to develop this land for a long time. Wallace Pemberton was a stubborn man. He made things difficult, but in the end, time catches up with everyone." He paused. "You should consider very carefully whether you want to continue his fight." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hargrove?" "It's advice, good advice." His voice softened again, but the warmth was gone. "This conversation isn't over. We'll speak again soon." The line went dead. Lorraine set down the phone. Her hands were steady, but her heart pounded in her chest. She had just refused more money than she had ever imagined. She had just challenged a man who clearly did not like being challenged. She had just committed herself to a battle she did not fully understand. But as she looked out at the forest, at the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze, she knew she had made the right choice. Wallace Pemberton had left her more than land. He had left her a responsibility, a purpose, a reason to matter in a world that had stopped noticing her years ago. The forest was waiting, and Lorraine Beckett was ready to fight for it. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the trees. Somewhere in the distance, birds sang their morning songs. The wind moved through the branches like a whisper. This was her home now. This was her battle. And somewhere in the shadows, she knew Preston Hargrove was already planning his next move. The town hall of Millbrook had not seen such a crowd in over a decade. Every seat was filled by the time Lorraine arrived, and people stood 3 deep along the back wall. Farmers in worn jackets sat beside shop owners in clean shirts. Retired couples whispered to each other in the middle rows. Young families clustered near the exits, children fidgeting with boredom while their parents leaned forward with interest. Everyone had heard the news. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Lorraine entered through the side door, hoping to avoid attention. She wore the same coat she had worn for years, the one with patches at the elbows and buttons that no longer matched. Her silver hair was pulled back simply. Her shoes, though clean, showed the wear of countless miles walked along the roads of Millbrook. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had nothing, and yet every head in the room turned toward her as she entered. The whispers began immediately. Lorraine heard fragments as she moved along the edge of the room, searching for a place to stand. "That's her, the one who inherited the forest. She was living at the shelter, I heard. 300 acres. Can you imagine? Why would old Pemberton leave anything to someone like her?" Lorraine found a spot near the back corner, partially hidden behind a support column. From here, she could see the front of the room where a podium had been set up. A large display board stood beside it, covered with a white cloth. Harrison Whitmore appeared at her side. The attorney looked uncomfortable in the crowded room, tugging at his collar as if the air had grown too thick. "You didn't have to come tonight," he said quietly. "I could have represented your interests." Lorraine shook her head. "No, I need to hear what he has to say." Before Whitmore could respond, the room fell silent. The side door near the front opened, and Preston Hargrove entered. He moved through the crowd like a man accustomed to being watched. His suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair immaculately styled. He nodded to familiar faces as he passed, shaking hands with town council members, exchanging brief words with business owners who hoped to benefit from whatever he was planning. Behind him came two younger men carrying briefcases and rolled documents. They set up near the podium with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Preston took his place at the front of the room. He surveyed the crowd with a smile that seemed warm but revealed nothing. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying easily without a microphone. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is a busy time of year, and I appreciate you taking the time to hear what I have to share." He gestured to one of his assistants, who removed the white cloth from the display board. The image beneath showed an architectural rendering of a luxury resort. Elegant cabins nestled among trees, a grand lodge with floor-to-ceiling windows, walking trails and a swimming pool, and a spa building with a copper roof. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "This," Preston said, "is the future of Millbrook." He let the image speak for itself for a moment before continuing. "For too long, this town has struggled. Young people leave for the cities because there are no opportunities here. Businesses close because there aren't enough customers. The tax base shrinks every year and services suffer as a result." Heads nodded throughout the room. These were problems everyone recognized. "But we have something valuable," Preston continued, "something that people will pay to experience. We have natural beauty. We have wilderness. We have the kind of peace and quiet that stressed city dwellers dream about." He pointed to the rendering. The Millbrook Forest Resort would bring that value to life. 24 luxury cabins, each renting for $300 per night or more. A central lodge with dining and event facilities. Walking trails, fishing access, wildlife viewing areas. He paused for effect. "And jobs. Real jobs for real people right here in Millbrook." A man near the front raised his hand. "How many jobs are we talking about?" Preston smiled. "Conservatively, 40 to 50 permanent positions. Housekeeping, maintenance, food service administration, plus seasonal work during peak months." He spread his hands. "That's 40 families who could stay in Millbrook instead of moving away. 40 paychecks spent at local businesses." The murmurs grew louder, more positive now. A woman called out from the middle of the room, "Where exactly would this resort be built?" Preston's smile remained fixed. "That brings us to the heart of the matter." He gestured to the map his assistant had hung beside the rendering. "The ideal location is here along the northern forest boundary, access to the river, views of the mountains, privacy and seclusion for our guests." He paused and his eyes found Lorraine across the crowded room. "Unfortunately, that land is currently owned by someone who has expressed reluctance to sell." Every head turned toward her. Lorraine felt the weight of hundreds of stares pressing against her. Her cheeks flushed, but she kept her expression neutral. Preston continued smoothly. "I have made a generous offer, $5 million for the forest land. That's far above market value, and it would allow the current owner to live very comfortably for the rest of her life." $5 million. The number hung in the air like something too large to comprehend. "But so far," Preston added, "she has declined." The mood in the room shifted. Lorraine could feel it, the change from curiosity to something harder. A man near the front spoke up. $5 million, and she said no. "That's correct." "Why?" Preston shrugged elegantly. "You would have to ask her." More eyes turned toward Lorraine. The whispers had grown louder, sharper. "Maybe she wants more money." "Greedy, if you ask me. What does a homeless woman need with 300 acres anyway?" Harrison Whitmore stepped forward slightly, as if to shield her from the stares. But Lorraine placed a hand on his arm. "I'll speak for myself," she said quietly. She stepped out from behind the support column and walked toward the front of the room. The crowd parted reluctantly, faces turning to watch her pass. She could feel their judgment pressing against her from all sides. When she reached the podium, Preston stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. "Mrs. Beckett, please share your thoughts with us." Lorraine looked out at the crowd. These were people she had lived among for 30 years. Shop owners who had sold her groceries when she still had a home. Neighbors who had attended her husband's funeral. Children she had watched grow into adults with families of their own. And yet they looked at her now as if she were a stranger. "My name is Lorraine Beckett," she began. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "Most of you don't remember me. That's all right. I've been easy to forget." A few faces in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. 3 weeks ago, I inherited a cabin and some land from a man named Wallace Pemberton. I never met him while he was alive. I didn't know he existed until his lawyer found me at the church shelter. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I've spent the last few weeks reading his journals, learning about who he was and what he believed in. She looked directly at Preston and learning about the people who spent 30 years trying to take his land. Preston's smile remained fixed, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Wallace Pemberton spent half his life protecting that forest," Lorraine continued. "He believed it was worth saving. Not for money, not for development, for itself." A man in the crowd called out, "That's real nice, lady. But what about the rest of us? What about the jobs? What about our kids who have to move away because there's nothing here for them?" Lorraine turned toward the voice. "I understand your frustration. I've lived in this town for 30 years. I've seen it change. I've seen businesses close and families leave." "Then sell the land," someone else shouted. "Take the money and let the rest of us have a chance." More voices joined in, overlapping, growing louder. $5 million. What right does she have to hold us back? She doesn't even pay taxes. She lives at the shelter. The words struck like stones. Lorraine felt her resolve wavering. These people were not villains. They were struggling families desperate for opportunity, and she was standing between them and what they believed would save them. Preston stepped forward, raising his hands for quiet. "Please, everyone. Mrs. Beckett is entitled to her opinion." His tone was conciliatory, but his eyes gleamed with something that looked like triumph. "However, perhaps we should consider the broader picture. One person's attachment to a piece of land versus the welfare of an entire community." He turned to face her directly. "Mrs. Beckett, I respect your feelings about Mr. Pemberton's legacy. But surely you can see that times have changed. This town needs investment. It needs opportunity. And my company is prepared to provide both." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. "In light of the community's interest, I am prepared to increase my offer. $6 million for the forest land. That's $1 million more than yesterday." He extended the paper toward her. "Take the money, Mrs. Beckett. Give this town a chance." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Lorraine, on the paper, and Preston's outstretched hand on the decision that seemed to hang in the air between them. Lorraine looked at the document. $6 million. More money than she could comprehend. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Enough to never sleep in a shelter again. She thought of the cabin, the journal, the words Wallace had written over 30 years of solitary guardianship, and she thought of Emmett, the way he had run toward danger instead of away from it, the way he had saved a stranger's life and never mentioned it afterward. "No," she said. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Preston's smile finally cracked. "Excuse me. I said no." Lorraine stepped back from the podium. "I'm not selling." The room erupted. Voices shouted over one another, angry and confused and frustrated. Someone near the back yelled something crude. A woman in the front row shook her head in visible disgust. Through it all, Preston Hargrove stood perfectly still, watching Lorraine with an expression that had lost all warmth. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly, his voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "A very serious mistake." Lorraine met his gaze. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." She turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted around her, but not with respect. People pulled away as if she carried something contagious. Faces twisted with anger and resentment. At the door, she paused and looked back at the room full of her neighbors, the people who had once been her community. "I'm sorry," she said, though she knew no one was listening, "but some things matter more than money." Then she stepped out into the cold night air and walked away alone. The walk back to the cabin took nearly 3 hours. Lorraine could have called Whitmore for a ride, but she needed the time. She needed the silence. She needed the physical motion of putting one foot in front of the other, while her mind struggled to process what had happened. The townspeople had turned against her, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had refused to do what they wanted. In their eyes, she had become the obstacle standing between Millbrook and prosperity. The forest stretched dark on either side of the road as she walked. Stars emerged overhead, scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on velvet. The cold bit at her cheeks and fingers, but she barely noticed. By the time she reached the cabin, the moon had risen above the trees. Its pale light turned the clearing silver, casting long shadows from the pines. The cabin looked smaller than it had this morning, as if the weight of the day had pressed it closer to the earth. Lorraine let herself inside and lit the oil lamp. The warm glow pushed back the darkness, revealing the familiar shapes of table and chair and stove. She sat down heavily and placed her hands flat on the wooden surface. $6 million. The number kept repeating in her mind. $6 million, and all she had to do was sign a piece of paper. She reached for Wallace's journal and opened it to a page she had marked earlier. The entry was dated 15 years ago during a previous wave of development pressure. March 3rd, 2010. They came to the cabin today. 3 men I didn't recognize. They said they were from the development company, but they didn't act like businessmen. They acted like enforcers. Lorraine turned the page. They told me that selling the land would be in my best interest. When I refused, one of them knocked over my woodpile. Another kicked the doorframe hard enough to crack the wood. The third just stood there smiling. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued reading. After they left, I found a note tucked under my door. Consider your options carefully. Accidents happen in isolated places. She looked up from the journal. The cabin suddenly felt less safe than it had before. April 15th, 2010. Someone poisoned the well. I've had to haul water from the creek for 2 weeks. I reported it to the sheriff, but nothing came of it. I'm told there's no evidence of who did it. June 22nd, 2010. 3 of my property markers on the eastern boundary have been destroyed, pulled up and thrown into the woods. I replaced them. They disappeared again. September 8th, 2010. Fire in the equipment shed last night. I managed to put it out before it spread to the cabin. The sheriff called it probably an electrical fault. There is no electricity in that shed. Lorraine closed the journal. The pattern was clear. For years, someone had been trying to force Wallace off his land through intimidation and sabotage. The tactics were subtle enough to avoid legal consequences, but persistent enough to make life difficult. And now Wallace was dead, and she was the new owner. She looked at the door at the window at the shadows pressing against the glass. The forest that had seemed so peaceful this morning now felt darker, more threatening. But she did not let fear consume her. Instead, she felt something else rising in her chest, something that felt almost like anger. These people, whoever they were, had tormented an old man for years. They had tried to drive him from his home through fear and violence, and they had failed. Wallace Pemberton had stood his ground, alone, for decades. Lorraine would do the same. She rose from the table and checked the locks on the door and windows. Then she pulled the old quilt from the bed, wrapped herself in it, and settled into the chair near the cold stove. Tomorrow she would learn more about what she was facing. Tonight she would keep watch. The break-in came 3 nights later. Lorraine had returned to town during the day to meet with Whitmore about legal matters. She had been away from the cabin for only 6 hours. When she returned, she found the door hanging open. Her heart lurched. She approached slowly, every sense alert. The evening light was fading, casting long shadows across the clearing. Nothing moved except the wind stirring the branches overhead. She pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The cabin had been ransacked. Drawers pulled out and emptied, shelves swept clean, the mattress overturned. Papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Lorraine stood in the doorway, taking in the destruction. Her hands shook, but not from fear. She moved through the room, slowly assessing the damage. The metal box that had held Wallace's documents was open and empty. The property surveys were gone. The land purchase agreements were gone. Only the journal remained lying on the floor beneath the overturned table. They had apparently not considered it valuable enough to take, but they had left something behind. On the wooden table, placed carefully where she would be certain to find it, sat a single sheet of paper. The words were printed in large block letters. Sell the land or lose everything. Lorraine picked up the note. The paper was standard printer, stock available at any office supply store. There would be no fingerprints, no traceable evidence. but the message was clear. She folded the note and placed it in her pocket. Then she began the slow work of putting the cabin back together. It took hours. By the time she finished, the moon had risen and the forest had grown quiet. Lorraine sat at the table exhausted but unable to sleep. The stolen documents were a blow. Without the property surveys and purchase agreements, it would be more difficult to prove her ownership of certain parcels. Whitmore had copies of some documents, but not all. Preston Hargrove was escalating. The next morning, Lorraine walked to town. She did not go to Whitmore's office or the shelter or any of the places she might normally visit. Instead, she went to the library. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a modest building on the corner of Main and 3rd. It had been built in the 1920s with a grant from a railroad magnate and had served the community ever since. The collection was small but well-maintained, including an archive of local newspapers stretching back nearly a century. Lorraine had not been inside the library in years. She had stopped reading for pleasure long ago when survival consumed all her energy, but now she had a different purpose. The librarian, a thin woman with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, looked up as Lorraine entered. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for old newspapers," Lorraine said, "from about 25 years ago." The librarian nodded and led her to a room at the back of the building. Here the newspaper archives were stored on microfilm and in bound volumes arranged by year. "What date are you looking for?" "October 1999 and the months following." The librarian pulled 3 bound volumes from the shelf and carried them to a reading table. "These are October through December. Let me know if you need anything else." Lorraine thanked her and began to search. She started with the week of Emmett's death. The accident had been reported in the local paper, a brief article on page 3. "Construction worker killed in scaffolding collapse." It named Emmett and one other man who had been injured. It quoted the construction company owner, expressing condolences. It mentioned nothing about the cause of the collapse. Lorraine turned the pages, carefully scanning headlines and articles. She was looking for something specific, though she was not entirely sure what. Then she found it. 2 weeks after Emmett's funeral, a small article appeared in the business section. "State agency investigates construction site safety after fatal accident." Lorraine leaned closer, reading carefully. The Montana Department of Labor had opened an investigation into safety practices at the construction site where Emmett died. According to the article, anonymous sources had alleged that substandard materials were used in the scaffolding structure. The investigation was ongoing. She turned to the next week's edition. Investigation expanded to include general contractor. The article named the construction company where Emmett had worked, but it also mentioned another name, Hargrove Development. Lorraine's breath caught. According to the article, Hargrove Development had been the general contractor on the project. The construction company was a subcontractor responsible for the actual building work, but Hargrove had been responsible for site management and safety oversight. She continued reading. Sources within the investigation suggest that safety equipment may have been removed from the site to reduce costs. The scaffolding that collapsed had reportedly been flagged for repair by workers 3 days before the accident. Those repairs were never made. Lorraine felt something cold spreading through her chest. She turned to the following months, searching for updates on the investigation. Hargrove Development disputes safety allegations. Preston Hargrove, identified in the article as the company's vice president, denied any wrongdoing. The article quoted him saying, "We take safety extremely seriously. This tragic accident was not the result of any negligence on our part." More weeks passed. More articles. Investigation inconclusive due to lack of evidence. The state agency had been unable to prove that safety violations caused the collapse. Key documents had been lost or destroyed. Witnesses had changed their stories. The case was closed without charges. The final article was dated 6 months after Emmett's death. Hargrove Development awarded contract for county building project. The company had moved on unscathed. Business continued. Profits grew. And Emmett remained dead. Lorraine sat very still, staring at the newspaper spread before her. Her hands had stopped shaking. Something else had replaced the trembling. Something hard and cold and clear. Her husband had died because someone decided that safety equipment was too expensive. Her husband had died because repairs were delayed to save money. Her husband had died because a company valued profit over human life. And the man who owned that company was now trying to take Wallace Pemberton's land. She thought of all the years she had struggled, the years of poverty and homelessness. The years of being invisible, forgotten, pitied. All of it traced back to that moment when the scaffolding collapsed. If Emmett had lived, everything would have been different. They would have kept their home. She would have kept her dignity. The long slide into invisibility would never have begun. And Preston Hargrove had continued building his empire as if none of it mattered. Lorraine carefully closed the newspaper volume. She sat for a long moment processing what she had learned. Then she stood, thanked the librarian, and walked out into the autumn sunlight. She knew what she had to do now. But first she needed proof. The county records office occupied the basement of the courthouse, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and the smell of old paper. The clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looked up as Lorraine entered. "Can I help you?" "I need to see construction permits and safety inspection records from 1999. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "That's going back a ways. Any particular project?" "The Riverside office complex. There was an accident at the site in October of that year." The clerk nodded slowly. "I remember that. Worker died, if I recall." He stood and disappeared into the maze of filing cabinets. Lorraine waited. The basement was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of footsteps on the floor above. After several minutes, the clerk returned. His expression had changed. "I'm sorry, but those records aren't available." "What do you mean, the file is missing?" He spread his hands. "It happens sometimes with older records. Things get misfiled or lost." Lorraine studied his face. Something about his expression suggested he was not telling the whole truth. "When was the file last accessed?" The clerk hesitated. "I can't give you that information." "Can't or won't." He looked away. "I'm sorry, there's nothing more I can do." Lorraine understood. Someone had removed the records. Someone with enough influence to ensure they stayed removed. She thanked the clerk and left. But she did not give up. Over the following days, Lorraine continued her investigation. She visited the state agency that had conducted the original investigation. She contacted former construction workers who had been on the site that day. She spoke with journalists who had covered the story. Each path led to the same destination. Evidence had been destroyed. Witnesses had been paid off or intimidated into silence. Records had disappeared. The investigation had been systematically undermined from within. And at the center of it all, like a spider in a web, sat Preston Hargrove. She learned more about him as she dug deeper. He had inherited Hargrove Development from his father, who had built the company in the 1970s. Under Preston's leadership, the company had grown aggressively, acquiring land and building projects across the state. But growth had come at a cost. There had been other accidents, other investigations, other settlements paid quietly to families who might otherwise have caused problems. Preston Hargrove had built his fortune on a foundation of human suffering, all while maintaining the appearance of a respectable businessman. And now he wanted the forest, the last piece of land he had been unable to acquire, the one thing Wallace Pemberton had protected for 30 years. Lorraine understood now why Wallace had fought so hard. It was never just about trees and wilderness. It was about standing against a man who believed he could take whatever he wanted, regardless of who got hurt. One evening, Lorraine sat in the cabin surrounded by the notes and documents she had gathered. The investigation had consumed her for 2 weeks. She had barely slept, driven by a fury she had not felt in decades. But she had hit a wall. The evidence she had found was suggestive, but not conclusive. The original records were gone. The witnesses were unreliable or unreachable. She had a story, but not proof. And without proof, she had nothing. She reached for Wallace's journal, seeking comfort in his words. The leather cover felt warm beneath her fingers, familiar now after so many readings. She opened to a page near the end dated just weeks before Wallace died. "I have spent 30 years fighting the same battle. Sometimes I wonder if it matters. The forest remains, but for how long? My body is failing. My time is running out." Lorraine turned the page. "But I have found something that gives me hope. Not evidence that will stand in court, perhaps, but truth. And truth has a power of its own." She frowned, the reading more carefully. "The answer lies in the records I kept. Not the property documents, though those are important. Something else. Something I discovered years ago and never revealed." Lorraine's heart began to beat faster. If you are reading this, you have found the journal. But have you found everything else? Look in the place where I kept my most precious memories. Look where no one would think to search. She set down the journal and looked around the cabin. She had searched the place thoroughly when she first arrived. The metal box under the floor, the shelves and drawers, the small closet. Where had she not looked? Her eyes fell on the stone fireplace. The hearth was cold, the ashes cleaned out long ago. Above it hung a simple wooden mantel bare except for a single faded photograph. Lorraine walked to the fireplace and lifted the photograph. It showed a young man in work clothes smiling at the camera. She had assumed it was Wallace in his youth, but now she looked more closely. The man in the photograph was not Wallace. The face was familiar. She had seen it every day for 20 years until the day it was taken from her. It was Emmett. Her hands trembled as she turned the photograph over. On the back in Wallace's careful handwriting were 3 words: "The debt I owe." She set the photograph on the mantel and ran her fingers along the wooden surface. The wood was smooth, polished by years of use, but at one end she felt a slight irregularity, a seam that did not quite match. She pressed the wood and something clicked. A small compartment opened at the end of the mantel, hidden so cleverly that she would never have found it by chance. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with string. Lorraine lifted the bundle carefully and carried it to the table. These were different from the other documents, not property records or purchase agreements. These were handwritten notes, correspondence, and what appeared to be photocopies of official documents. She began to read. The first page was a letter dated 1999, addressed to the Montana Department of Labor. It was signed by Wallace Pemberton. "I am writing to report unsafe conditions at the Riverside Office Complex construction site. I witnessed scaffolding being assembled without proper safety equipment. I reported this to the site manager, but no action was taken. 3 days later, the scaffolding collapsed. A worker named Emmett Beckett died trying to save my life." Lorraine's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes and continued reading. "I believe this accident was preventable. I believe the general contractor, Hargrove Development, bears responsibility for the unsafe conditions. I am prepared to testify to what I witnessed." The next document was a response from the state agency acknowledging receipt of the complaint and assigning an investigator. Then came a series of notes in Wallace's handwriting. December 15th, 1999. Investigator contacted me. Says case is progressing. Witnesses are cooperating. January 3rd, 2000. Investigator called again. Some documents are missing from the site files. He seems concerned. February 10th, 2000. Investigation suspended due to lack of evidence. My testimony alone is not enough. March 25th, 2000. I saw Preston Hargrove in town today. He looked at me and smiled. He knows who I am. He knows I tried to hold him accountable. Lorraine turned to the next set of documents. These were photocopies of what appeared to be internal company memos. Site Safety Assessment, Riverside Office Complex, recommendation. Replace scaffolding support brackets. Current brackets do not meet code requirements. The memo was dated 1 week before the accident. Another document showed a purchase order for replacement brackets. It had been filled out but never submitted. The date was 3 days before the accident. The evidence was clear. The company had known the scaffolding was unsafe. They had been told to fix it, and they had chosen not to. At the bottom of the bundle was a final letter. It was addressed to Wallace from an anonymous source dated 5 years after the accident. Mr. Pemberton, I worked in the Hargrove Development Office during the Riverside project. I kept copies of documents that were later destroyed. I am sending them to you because I believe you deserve to know the truth. I cannot testify publicly. I have a family to protect. But perhaps these records will be useful to you someday. Lorraine set down the papers. Her whole body was shaking now. She had proof, real proof. Evidence that Preston Hargrove's company had known about the unsafe scaffolding and done nothing. Evidence that they had covered up their negligence after Emmett died. This was what Wallace had been protecting all along. Not just the forest, but the truth. For a long moment, Lorraine sat perfectly still. The cabin was silent. The forest outside held its breath. Then she began to cry. She cried for Emmett, whose death had been preventable. She cried for the years of poverty and isolation that had followed. She cried for Wallace, who had carried this burden alone for 25 years. And she cried for herself, for the woman she had been before everything fell apart, for the life she had lost and could never reclaim. The tears continued for a long time. When they finally stopped, Lorraine felt empty, hollowed out, as if something that had been blocking her for years had finally broken loose. She looked at the documents spread across the table. Then she looked at the photograph of Emmett on the mantel. "I found it," she whispered. "I finally found the truth." But finding the truth was not the same as knowing what to do with it. The documents were old. The statute of limitations on any criminal charges had long since passed. Preston Hargrove could not be arrested for what had happened 25 years ago. But the truth was still powerful. In the right hands, these documents could destroy his reputation. They could expose him to civil liability. They could turn the community against him. Or they could be buried again and life would continue as before. Lorraine gathered the papers carefully and placed them back in the hidden compartment. Tomorrow she would decide what to do. Tonight she needed to grieve. She picked up Emmett's photograph and held it close to her chest. The face in the picture smiled up at her, frozen in a moment before everything went wrong. "I miss you," she said quietly. "Every single day I miss you." The cabin held its silence around her. Outside, the forest waited. The next evening, Lorraine sat at the table with the documents spread before her. A pen lay beside a blank sheet of paper, and next to the paper sat a contract. Preston Hargrove had sent another offer. $7 million this time. The amount seemed almost absurd, a number so large that it lost all meaning. But the note that accompanied the contract was what held her attention. "Mrs. Beckett, this is my final offer. $7 million for the forest land. I urge you to consider carefully before refusing. The consequences of continued resistance may be more than you are prepared to handle. Sincerely, Preston Hargrove." The threat was barely veiled. Accept the money or face something worse than break-ins and threatening notes. Lorraine looked at the contract. $7 million would change everything. She could leave Millbrook, start fresh, somewhere else, live comfortably for the rest of her life. All she had to do was sign away the land Wallace had spent 30 years protecting. All she had to do was let Preston Hargrove win. She picked up the pen. The weight of it felt enormous in her hand. She thought of the townspeople at the meeting shouting at her for refusing to sell. She thought of the ransacked cabin, the threatening note. She thought of the evidence, hidden in the mantle, the truth that could destroy Preston Hargrove, but might not be enough to save anyone. And she thought of Emmett. He had run toward danger. He had saved a stranger's life without thinking of his own safety. He had died because someone valued profit over people. Would he want her to fight, or would he want her to take the money and find peace? The pen hovered over the signature line. Lorraine's hand trembled. The cabin was silent. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. She lowered the pen toward the paper. And then she saw it. Wallace's journal lying open where she had left it earlier. A page near the end, one she had read before, but not truly understood. October 1st. I have watched Emmett's widow for many years now. I have seen what life has done to her. I have seen her lose everything one piece at a time. Lorraine's hand stopped moving. But I have also seen something else. I have seen her refuse to give up. I have seen her help others even when she had nothing. I have seen her keep her dignity when the world tried to strip it away. Tears welled in her eyes. Emmett Beckett did not give up when the scaffolding collapsed. He ran toward the fire, not away from it, and I believe his wife is made of the same material. The final line seemed to glow on the page. Emmett did not give up. I did not give up. And I believe this woman will not give up either. Lorraine set down the pen. She looked at the contract, at the $7 million that could buy her comfort and security and escape. Then she picked up the document and tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the cabin. She tore it again and again until the contract was nothing but scattered pieces on the wooden floor. Then she stood, walked to the fireplace, and gathered the fragments. One by one, she fed them into the cold hearth. Tomorrow she would light a fire and watch them burn. But tonight she had made her decision. She was not going to run. She was not going to hide. She was not going to let Preston Hargrove win. Wallace Pemberton had fought for 30 years. Her husband had died trying to save a stranger. Now it was her turn to stand. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark forest. The trees stood tall and silent against the night sky, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Somewhere out there, Preston Hargrove was waiting for her answer. She whispered into the darkness, her voice steady and clear. "Not today. Not ever. This ends when I decide it ends." The forest seemed to lean closer, listening. And in the silence of that lonely cabin, surrounded by trees and secrets and the ghosts of men who had never given up, Lorraine Beckett finally understood who she was meant to be. The morning after she tore up Preston Hargrove's contract, Lorraine woke before dawn. The cabin was cold, the fire in the stove having burned down to embers during the night. She lay still beneath the old quilt, watching the first gray light seep through the windows. For a long moment, she simply breathed, in and out, slow and steady, the way she had learned to breathe during the hardest years when each day felt like a mountain to climb. But this morning was different. Something had shifted inside her during the night. The fear was still there, coiled in her chest like a sleeping animal. But it no longer controlled her. Instead, she felt something else rising through her bones, something that felt like purpose. She had spent 25 years being invisible, 25 years being forgotten, overlooked, dismissed, 25 years watching the world move past her as if she did not exist. That ended today. Lorraine rose from the bed and walked to the fireplace. The hidden compartment in the mantel held its secret safe. She withdrew the bundle of documents and carried them to the table. Then she began to work. The plan formed slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle assembling itself. She did not have money or power or connections. She did not have lawyers or journalists or politicians on her side. But she had something else. She had the truth. And she knew where to find people who would believe her. The town of Millbrook had turned against her at the meeting, but not everyone in that room had been hostile. She remembered faces in the crowd, expressions that seemed troubled rather than angry. People who had listened to Preston Hargrove's promises but had not quite believed them. Those were the people she needed to find. Lorraine spent the first day making copies. Whitmore's office had a small copier that he allowed her to use. Page by page, she duplicated every document Wallace had hidden. The letters, the memos, the photocopied records. The evidence of negligence and cover-up. When she finished, she had 3 complete sets. One she hid in the cabin, one she gave to Whitmore for safekeeping, the third she carried with her. Then she began to walk. Her first visit was to a small house on the edge of town where a man named George Holloway lived alone. George was 73 years old. He had worked construction for 40 years before his body gave out. His hands were gnarled from decades of labor, and he walked with a limp from an old injury. Lorraine had seen him at the town meeting. He had not shouted with the others. He had simply watched his weathered face, unreadable. She knocked on his door. George answered slowly, leaning on a cane. His eyes widened slightly when he recognized her. "Mrs. Beckett, Mr. Holloway, may I come in?" He hesitated, then stepped aside. The house was modest but clean. Photographs lined the walls showing a younger George with his wife and children. A lifetime of memories preserved in frames. They sat at his kitchen table, and Lorraine told him why she had come. "I know what happened at the Riverside site in 1999, she said. "I know my husband died because of unsafe equipment, and I know Hargrove Development was responsible." George's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "I was there," he said quietly. "I was working on the 2nd level when the scaffolding came down." Lorraine leaned forward. "Did you see what happened?" George was silent for a long moment. His gnarled hands rested on the table, motionless. "The brackets were bad," he finally said. "We told them 3 days before we told the site manager the scaffolding needed repairs. He said they would handle it." George's voice hardened. "They never did." "Would you be willing to say that publicly?" George looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and said too little. "Mrs. Beckett, I've been carrying that weight for 25 years. Every time I close my eyes, I see your husband running toward the collapse. I see him pulling that other fellow out." He paused. "And I see the scaffolding coming down on top of him." Where Lorraine's throat tightened. "I wanted to speak up back then," George continued, "but I had a family, mortgage, kids in school. They made it clear what would happen if I talked." He shook his head slowly. "So I stayed quiet, and I've hated myself for it ever since." Lorraine reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "It's not too late," she said. George looked at her hand, then at her face. Something changed in his expression. The weight he had carried seemed to lighten just slightly. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." Over the following week, Lorraine visited more people. Some she found through George, who knew other workers from the old construction crews. Some she found through Whitmore, who had handled legal matters for families in town for decades. Some she found simply by walking and asking questions. Each visit followed a similar pattern. Lorraine would sit in a kitchen or a living room or on a porch, and she would listen. She would ask about the past, about accidents and injuries and promises broken, and slowly, carefully, she would reveal what she knew. Not everyone was willing to talk. Some doors closed in her face. Some people listened but refused to commit. Fear still held power over them even after all these years. But others responded differently. Martha Hendricks was 68 years old. Her husband had been injured at a Hargrove construction site in 2005, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. The company had settled quietly, paying just enough to avoid a lawsuit, but not enough to cover the lifetime of care he would need. "They took everything from us," Martha said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Our savings, our future, our dignity, and then they moved on like nothing happened." "Would you speak at a public meeting?" Lorraine asked. Martha nodded slowly. "I've been waiting for someone to ask." Robert Chen was 75. He had owned a small farm on the outskirts of town until Hargrove Development had pressured him to sell. When he refused, mysterious problems began. His well was contaminated. His fences were torn down. His livestock escaped through gates that somehow came unlocked in the night. "I held out for 3 years," Robert said, "but eventually I just couldn't fight anymore. I sold the land for half what it was worth, and they built a shopping center on it." His jaw tightened. "I've never forgiven myself for giving up." "This is your chance to fight back," Lorraine said. "Not just for yourself, for everyone they've hurt." Robert met her eyes. "Tell me what you need me to do." By the end of the second week, Lorraine had assembled a group of 12 people willing to speak publicly about their experiences with Hargrove Development. 12 ordinary citizens. 12 stories of negligence, intimidation, and corporate indifference. 12 witnesses to the truth. Whitmore watched the process with growing admiration. "You've done what no one else could do," he told her one afternoon in his office. "You've given these people a reason to come forward." Lorraine shook her head. "I just asked them. They've been waiting for someone to listen." "That's exactly my point." Whitmore leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Beckett, I've practiced law in this town for 30 years. I've seen people try to stand up against powerful interests before. Most of them failed because they fought alone." He gestured toward the window toward the town beyond. "You're not fighting alone. You're building an army." Lorraine looked at the stack of documents on his desk, the copied evidence, the witness statements, the timeline of accidents and cover-ups stretching back decades. "An army of forgotten people," she said quietly. "People nobody listened to. People nobody believed. Sometimes those are the strongest armies of all." The town council called a special meeting for the last Saturday of October. The stated purpose was to discuss the development proposal, but everyone knew the real reason. Lorraine Beckett had requested time to speak. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Some people predicted she would finally accept Preston's offer. Others thought she would make a fool of herself. A few hoped she might actually have something important to say. On the morning of the meeting, Lorraine woke early and dressed in clothes she had not worn in years. A simple navy dress carefully pressed, low-heeled shoes polished clean, her silver hair brushed back from her face. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the cabin's wash basin. The woman who stared back was still weathered, still marked by years of hardship. But her eyes were different now. Steady, clear, unafraid. "Today," she said to her reflection, "today we find out what we're made of." She gathered the documents and walked out into the cold morning air. The forest stood silent around her, the trees draped in autumn colors. Gold and red and brown, the palette of endings and beginnings. Whitmore picked her up at the main road in his sedan. They drove to town in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived. Lorraine saw George Holloway near the front, sitting with Martha Hendricks and Robert Chen. The other witnesses had gathered in clusters throughout the room, their faces determined. Preston Hargrove stood near the podium, surrounded by his usual entourage. He wore another perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. When he saw Lorraine enter, his smile flickered briefly, then returned. "Mrs. Beckett," he called out across the room, "I'm glad you could join us. I trust you have reconsidered my offer." Lorraine did not respond. She walked past him without a word and took her place near the front of the room. The town council chairman called the meeting to order. The usual formalities followed, minutes approved and announcements made. Then the chairman turned to the main business. "We're here today to continue our discussion of the proposed development project," he said. "Mr. Hargrove has requested additional time to present an updated proposal, and Mrs. Beckett has requested an opportunity to address the council." He looked between them. "Mr. Hargrove, you may proceed first." Preston stepped to the podium with practiced confidence. His presentation was even more polished than before, featuring new renderings and economic projections and testimonials from business leaders across the state. "This project represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Millbrook," he concluded. "Jobs, revenue growth, everything this town has been waiting for." He paused, letting his words settle. "And to show my commitment to making this work for everyone, I am prepared to increase my offer to the current landowner one final time." He turned to face Lorraine directly. $7 million, Mrs. Beckett. That is my final offer. $7 million for the forest land, plus a commitment to hire local workers for every phase of the project. His smile widened. "What do you say?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Lorraine. She rose slowly from her seat. The documents were tucked under her arm, their weight both physical and symbolic. She walked to the podium as Preston stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. For a long moment, Lorraine simply stood there, looking out at the crowd. She saw familiar faces and strangers. She saw hope and skepticism and hostility. She saw the town that had forgotten her, now forced to remember. "My name is Lorraine Beckett," she began. Her voice was steady, carrying easily through the silent room. "Most of you know me, though you may not remember. I've lived in Millbrook for over 30 years. I was married here, I buried my husband here, and for the past 7 years I've been homeless here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "3 weeks ago, a man named Wallace Pemberton left me his property, a cabin and 312 acres of forest land. I never met Wallace while he was alive. I didn't know he existed, but I've spent the past weeks learning about who he was and what he believed." She opened the folder in her hands. Wallace Pemberton was a quiet man. He lived alone, kept to himself, rarely came to town. Most people thought he was just a hermit, but the truth is more complicated than that. She looked directly at Preston Hargrove. "The truth is Wallace spent 30 years protecting that forest from people who wanted to destroy it. He bought land piece by piece, year after year, building a barrier against development. And the whole time he was being threatened, intimidated, and harassed by the same company that now wants to buy the land from me." Preston's smile tightened. "Mrs. Beckett, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but these accusations are completely unfounded." "Are they?" Lorraine withdrew a document from her folder. "This is a letter Wallace wrote to the Montana Department of Labor, in 1999. He reported unsafe conditions at a construction site where Hargrove Development was the general contractor. He witnessed scaffolding being assembled without proper safety equipment." She paused. 3 days later, that scaffolding collapsed. A man named Emmett Beckett died. The room went absolutely still. "Emmett Beckett was my husband." Lorraine let the words settle before continuing. "The state investigated, but somehow key documents disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. The case was closed without charges." She withdrew another paper. "This is an internal memo from Hargrove Development dated 1 week before the accident. It recommends replacing the scaffolding brackets because they don't meet code requirements." Preston stepped forward. "Where did you get that?" "Those documents were never made public." "No, they weren't." Lorraine met his gaze. "Because someone made sure they would never see the light of day. But Wallace Pemberton kept copies, and now I have them." She turned back to the crowd. "My husband didn't have to die. He died because a company decided that safety equipment was too expensive. He died because repairs were delayed to save money. He died because someone valued profit over human life." A woman in the back of the room began to cry softly. "But I'm not the only one with a story like this." Lorraine gestured toward the front rows. "George Holloway was working at that same construction site. He tried to warn the supervisors about the unsafe scaffolding. They ignored him." George stood slowly, his cane supporting his weight. "It's true," he said, his voice rough with emotion. We told them 3 days before. They said they would handle it. They never did. Martha Hendricks's husband was paralyzed at another Hargrove site in 2005. Lorraine continued. The company settled quietly and moved on. Martha rose to her feet. They paid us just enough to keep us quiet, not enough to actually help. My husband spent his last years in a wheelchair, and they never even apologized. Robert Chen lost his farm after Hargrove pressured him to sell. When he refused, his well was poisoned and his fences were torn down. Robert stood. I held out as long as I could, but they broke me. They took everything I had built over 40 years. One by one, the witnesses rose. 12 voices, 12 stories, 25 years of accumulated pain and injustice finally spoken aloud. The crowd listened in stunned silence. Preston Hargrove's face had gone pale. His composed expression cracked, revealing something cold and desperate beneath. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice rising. "These are unsubstantiated accusations. Ancient history. You can't prove any of this." Lorraine turned to face him. "Can't I?" She withdrew the final document from her folder. "This is a letter from an anonymous whistleblower who worked in your office during the Riverside Project. They kept copies of the documents that were later destroyed. They sent them to Wallace Pemberton because they wanted someone to know the truth." She held up the papers. Memoranda, purchase orders, safety assessments, all of it proving that your company knew the scaffolding was dangerous and chose to do nothing. Her voice hardened. "My husband died saving Wallace Pemberton's life, and you are the reason he had to." The room erupted. People were shouting, crying, demanding answers. The council chairman banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Preston Hargrove stood frozen at the edge of the podium. His carefully constructed facade had shattered. The confident developer, the smooth-talking businessman, was gone. In his place stood a man whose lies had finally caught up with him. "This isn't over," he said, his voice barely audible above the chaos. "You have no idea what you've started." Lorraine met his gaze without flinching. "You're right," she said. "It isn't over, but it will be, because the truth has a way of finding the light no matter how deep you bury it." Preston turned and pushed through the crowd toward the exit. His assistants scrambled to follow. The door slammed behind them and the sound echoed through the hall like an exclamation point. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then someone began to clap. It started slowly, a single pair of hands in the back row. Then another joined, and another. The applause spread through the room like a wave, building in intensity until the walls seemed to shake with it. George Holloway was crying openly, his weathered face streaked with tears. Martha Hendricks embraced the woman beside her. Robert Chen simply nodded, his expression one of profound relief. Lorraine stood at the podium, surrounded by the sound of recognition she had not heard in 25 years. She was no longer invisible. The weeks that followed brought changes Lorraine could not have imagined. The documents she had presented became the subject of intense scrutiny. Local journalists investigated her claims and found them credible. State agencies reopened old files. Lawyers began reaching out to families who had been affected by Hargrove Development's negligence over the years. Preston Hargrove's empire began to crumble. Contracts were canceled. Partners distanced themselves. The development proposal for the forest land was quietly withdrawn. 3 months after the town meeting, federal investigators arrived in Millbrook. They came with subpoenas and questions tracing the threads of corruption that Lorraine had exposed. By spring, criminal charges were filed. Fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal evidence in a wrongful death case. Preston Hargrove was arrested on a Tuesday morning, led out of his office in handcuffs while cameras recorded every step. Lorraine watched the news coverage from the cabin, the same cabin where Wallace Pemberton had spent 30 years waiting for this moment. "We did it," she said quietly to the empty room. "We finally did it." But justice for the past was only part of what she had accomplished. There was still the future to consider. The forest remained hers. 312 acres of pine and cedar, stream and ridge, silence and shadow. The land Wallace had protected for 3 decades now waited for her to decide what it would become. She spent long hours walking the property, learning its contours and secrets. She discovered a meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring. She found a stream where trout flashed silver in the clear water. She stood on a ridge and looked out at the mountains stretching toward the horizon. The forest was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she had ever owned, more beautiful than anything she had ever expected to call her own. But beauty alone was not enough. Wallace had protected this land for a reason. He had believed it mattered. And now Lorraine needed to understand why. The answer came to her slowly over weeks of reflection. She thought about the shelter where she had spent 7 winters. She thought about the faces she had seen there, the stories she had heard. Men and women who had lost everything. Families torn apart by circumstance. Children who had never known what it felt like to have a stable home. She thought about herself at the lowest point when she had nothing but a thin coat and a plastic bag of aluminum cans. She thought about the cold nights and the hunger and the crushing weight of invisibility. And she thought about what might have saved her. What might have made the difference? Not money. Money was useful, but it could be lost as easily as it was gained. Not charity. Charity helped in the moment, but it could not rebuild a broken spirit. What she had needed, what so many people needed, was simpler than that. A place to belong, a chance to start over, a home. The idea crystallized in her mind with sudden clarity. She would not sell the forest. She would not develop it. She would not turn it into a resort or a subdivision or anything else that would benefit only the wealthy. Instead, she would use it to help people like herself, people who had fallen through the cracks, people who needed a second chance. She would build homes. The first cottage took shape in early spring. It was small, just 2 rooms and a bathroom, but it was solid and warm and filled with light. Volunteers from town came to help with the construction. George Holloway supervised the framing despite his bad hip. Robert Chen donated lumber from his new property. Martha Hendricks organized meals for the work crews. The community that had once turned against Lorraine now rallied around her vision. By summer, 3 cottages stood at the edge of the forest, tucked among the trees like natural outgrowths of the land. Each one was simple but comfortable, designed for single individuals or small families who needed a place to rebuild their lives. The first resident moved in on a warm July afternoon. Her name was Catherine, and she was 58 years old. She had lost her husband to cancer 3 years earlier, and the medical bills had consumed everything they had saved. She had been living in her car for the past 8 months. Lorraine met her at the door of the cottage and handed her the key. "It's yours for as long as you need it," Lorraine said. "No rent, no obligations, just a chance to get back on your feet." Catherine looked at the small house, at the forest beyond, at the woman who had given her this gift. Then she began to cry. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Lorraine smiled. "You don't have to thank me. Just pass it on when you can. Help someone else the way you're being helped." Catherine nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will. I promise I will." Over the following months, more residents arrived. A young mother fleeing an abusive relationship, an elderly veteran struggling with PTSD, a family of 4 who had lost everything in a house fire. Each one received a key and a chance. Each one became part of the community that was growing at the edge of the forest. Lorraine did not do this work alone. The townspeople who had witnessed her courage at the meeting became her allies and supporters. Donations arrived from across the state. Volunteers came on weekends to build more cottages, to plant gardens, to create the infrastructure of a new kind of community. They called it Pemberton Woods, in honor of the man who had protected the land for so long. One evening in late autumn, Harrison Whitmore came to the cabin with a final piece of business. "Mrs. Beckett," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "I have something for you." He withdrew an envelope from his briefcase. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges. Her name was written across the front in Wallace's familiar handwriting. "I was instructed to give you this after you had, and I quote, passed the first test." Whitmore smiled slightly. "I believe you have more than satisfied that requirement." Lorraine took the envelope. Her hands were steady as she opened it, though her heart beat faster. Inside was a single page covered in Wallace's careful script. "Dear Lorraine," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you have chosen to fight. It means you have refused to surrender to those who would destroy what I spent my life protecting. It means I was right about you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she continued reading. "I watched you for 7 years before I died. I saw you at the shelter sharing your food with others who had even less. I saw you helping at the church, sweeping floors and folding clothes, never asking for recognition. I saw you walking the roads of this town, collecting cans, surviving with a dignity that put comfortable people to shame." She wiped her eyes and read on. Your husband Emmett saved my life the day the scaffolding collapsed. I owe him a debt I can never repay. But as I watched you over the years, I came to understand something important. Emmett saved my life, but you showed me what life is worth. You taught me that true wealth is not measured in acres or dollars. It is measured in how we treat those who have nothing. It is measured in the courage to stand up when everyone else looks away. It is measured in the dignity we maintain when the world tries to strip it from us. Lorraine's tears fell freely now, dropping onto the paper. I leave you this land, not because your husband saved me, though that is part of it. I leave it to you because you are the person I trust to protect it. You know what it means to have nothing. You know what it means to be forgotten. And because of that, you will never forget others who are in that place. The forest is yours now. Do with it what your heart tells you is right. And know this, Lorraine Beckett, I have never forgotten what Emmett did for me, and I will never forget what you did for my faith in humanity. The letter was signed simply, Wallace. Lorraine sat in silence for a long time after she finished reading. The cabin was quiet around her, filled with the golden light of late afternoon. Outside, the forest stood tall and patient, the same forest that had witnessed so much over the past 30 years. He knew, she finally said. All along he knew. Whitmore nodded. He was a remarkable man, and he recognized something remarkable in you. Lorraine looked out the window at the trees, at the mountains beyond, at the sky turning orange with sunset. I spent so many years thinking I was invisible, she said quietly, thinking nobody saw me, nobody cared. But you were wrong. Yes. She folded the letter carefully and held it against her heart. I was wrong. 6 months later, on a clear spring morning, Lorraine stood on the porch of the cabin and looked out at what she had built. 5 cottages now dotted the edge of the forest, their windows catching the early light. Smoke rose from chimneys as residents prepared for the day. Children's laughter drifted through the trees, the sound of life renewed. The community called itself Pemberton Woods, but the townspeople had given it another name as well, Beckett's Haven. Lorraine smiled at the thought. She had never wanted recognition. She had never asked for fame or gratitude. She had simply done what needed to be done the same way Emmett had done 25 years ago when he ran toward a collapsing scaffold instead of away from it. Some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth protecting. And some things were worth remembering even when the world tried to forget. She walked inside and sat at the wooden table, the same table where Wallace had written his journal entries for 30 years. The leather-bound book lay open before her, filled with decades of careful observations and quiet determination. Lorraine picked up a pen. For a moment, she hesitated. This journal had been Wallace's private record, his chronicle of a solitary battle against forces much larger than himself. It felt presumptuous to add her own words to his, but then she remembered what he had written in his final letter. The forest is yours now. Do with it what your heart tells you is right. She began to write. May 15th. Today the forest is still safe. The cottages are full. The community is growing. And for the first time in 7 years, you have a home. She paused, looking out the window at the sunlight filtering through the pine branches. I think often of the people who brought me here. Of Wallace, who watched over me when I didn't know anyone was looking. Of Emmett, who saved a stranger's life and paid for it with his own. Of all the quiet heroes who do what is right without expecting reward or recognition. She continued writing. I spent so long believing I was invisible. I spent so long thinking that my life didn't matter, that nobody noticed whether I existed or not. I was wrong. Wallace noticed. He saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He trusted me with his life's work, his 30 years of quiet resistance, his belief that some things are worth protecting. I understand now what he was trying to tell me. True wealth is not what we own. It is what we leave behind for others. It is the courage to stand when everyone else has given up. It is the dignity we maintain when the world tries to strip it away. She set down the pen and closed the journal. Outside, the forest stirred in the morning breeze. The trees swayed gently, their branches reaching toward the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing. Lorraine walked to the door and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the smell of home. Below her, at the edge of the clearing, she could see Catherine working in her small garden. The woman who had once lived in her car now grew tomatoes and beans and flowers that brightened the forest edge. She looked up and waved, her face glowing with health and purpose. Further along the path, George Holloway sat on his own porch, coffee in hand, watching the morning unfold. The weight he had carried for 25 years had finally lifted. He came by the cabin often now, sharing stories of the old days, laughing at memories that had once been too painful to speak. The forest stretched endlessly beyond them, its boundaries protected, its future secured. 312 acres of wilderness, preserved not as a monument, but as a living thing. Birds nested in its branches. Deer walked its paths. Streams ran clear through its heart. This was Wallace's legacy, and now it was hers. Lorraine thought of all the years she had walked the roads of Millbrook, collecting cans, sleeping in shelters, being looked through as if she didn't exist. She thought of the hunger and the cold and the crushing loneliness, and she thought of how far she had come. Not to wealth in the way most people measured it. The cottages generated no profit. The forest produced no income. She lived simply in the same cabin where Wallace had spent his final years. But she was rich in ways that mattered. She had purpose. She had community. She had the knowledge that her life meant something, that her existence made a difference in the world. And she had home. The word echoed in her mind like a prayer finally answered. Home. For 7 years, she had slept on shelter cots and church benches, always one step away from the street. For 25 years before that, she had watched her life crumble piece by piece, losing everything she thought she had. But now, standing on the porch of a cabin at the edge of a protected forest, surrounded by people whose lives she had helped rebuild, Lorraine finally understood what Wallace had been trying to tell her. Home was not a building. It was not a place you could own or buy or inherit. Home was belonging. Home was purpose. Home was the feeling that you mattered, that someone would notice if you were gone. She had found that here in this unlikely place among these unlikely people. A car appeared on the dirt road winding through the trees. Whitmore's sedan, bringing another visitor to Pemberton Woods. This was how it happened now, week after week. People heard about what Lorraine had built, and they came to see for themselves. Some were journalists wanting to tell the story. Some were donors wanting to contribute. Some were people in need hoping for a second chance. Lorraine welcomed them all. The sedan stopped at the edge of the clearing, and a woman stepped out. She was young, perhaps 30, with dark hair and tired eyes. A small boy held her hand, looking around at the forest with weeds-wide, uncertain wonder. Lorraine walked down from the porch to meet them. "Welcome to Pemberton Woods," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Lorraine." The woman shook her hand nervously. "I'm Sarah. This is my son, Michael." She hesitated. "Mr. Whitmore said you might have a place for us." Lorraine looked at the woman's tired face, at the boy's guarded eyes. She saw herself in them, the person she had been years ago when hope seemed like a luxury she could not afford. "We have a cottage available," she said. "It's not large, but it's warm and safe. You can stay as long as you need." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you." Lorraine smiled, remembering the same words Catherine had spoken when she arrived. "You don't have to thank me. Just pass it on when you can." She led them toward one of the cottages, the boy's hands slowly relaxing in his mother's grip as he looked around at the forest, at the other homes, at the people who smiled and waved as they passed. This was what Wallace had protected the land for. This was what Emmett had died for, though neither of them could have known it at the time. Not trees, not wilderness, not real estate. People. Chances. Second beginnings. That night, Lorraine sat alone on the cabin porch, watching the stars emerge above the forest. The cottages below glowed with warm light. Voices drifted through the darkness, conversations and laughter, and the ordinary sounds of life being lived. She thought of Wallace alone in this same spot for 30 years, watching over land he loved, fighting battles no one knew about. She thought of Emmett running toward danger because it was the right thing to do. She thought of herself walking the roads of Millbrook with a plastic bag of cans invisible to everyone, except a dying man who saw what others refused to see. The thread of their lives had woven together across decades, connecting past and present, loss and redemption, death and new beginnings. And now that thread continued extending into a future none of them could have imagined. Lorraine reached into her pocket and withdrew the photograph she always carried with her. Emmett's face smiled up at her in the starlight, frozen in a moment before everything changed. "I kept my promise," she said quietly. "I protected what mattered. I helped people who needed it. I didn't give up." The forest rustled softly around her as if in answer. I hope you're proud of me, she whispered. Wherever you are, I hope you can see what we built. She tucked the photograph back into her pocket and looked out at the darkness. The stars burned cold and bright above the trees. The mountains stood silent against the sky. And in the middle of it all, in a cabin at the edge of a forest she had never known existed until a few months ago, a woman who had once been invisible finally understood her place in the world. She was not rich in the way the world measured wealth, but she was home, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.